And going back to when I was just a young boy, probably 9 or 10 years old, he introduced me to his Beehive photos and the books of Ed Fitkin, including the Gas House Gang of Hockey. And it's between those two that I really found out a great deal about, or found a great love for Charlie Conacher at that time, who was certainly among the most popular players and certainly among the best players of that time. So I decided to take us a little bit off the beaten path today and do a football presentation. But I hope that you'll tolerate me and understand where I'm going. So the 1930s were a terrible time right across the continent, specifically in Toronto. As many as 40% of the population was unemployed. There we go, perfect. And so, it was a tough time because there was no money, but how do you get through challenging times like that? Well, the good news is that there's several things that brought some consolation to people. One of them was the fact that it turned out to be the golden age of sports. Really a really special time at that time too. And it was fueled in large part by radio, which had been introduced in the 1920s, but really found its place in every home across the continent, but we'll talk about Canada specifically here. During that time, it was the source of entertainment. It was cheap, it was accessible, and it was a very special thing. Oh, you're good, John. Thank you. Here's a picture of CFCA, which was the Toronto Daily Star's radio station. At the time, there were several radio stations, CKGW, which was the Gooderham and Wirtz radio station, but CFCA is the one that we'll talk about here. I talked about the golden age of sports. It was a magical time. There were terrific athletes. A gentleman by the name of Torchy Peaton, red-haired Torchy Peaton, who was the greatest athlete in 6-day bicycle races. There was Percy Williams, who was a star in track and field as well. There were the Toronto Oslers and the Toronto Hillcrest baseball teams, both doing remarkable things and doing a terrific, there we go, just great entertainment for people across the city as well. And part of that was because Maple Leaf Stadium had been built in 1926. Not Maple Leaf Gardens, but Maple Leaf Stadium. It was at the foot of Bathurst, right where the terminal for the I can't remember the name of the flight, but anyway, of the small airport that goes there. And it was right beside Tip Top Tailors, for those who have spent some time in Toronto as well. And Maple Leaf Stadium was key to so much that was going on at that particular time. Another athlete who we have to note is Bobby Rosenfeld. Bobby Rosenfeld was an extraordinary female athlete. She was in the Olympics in 1928. She played, like we'll find out in a few moments' time, multi-sports athletes were very common, but she played tennis and starred in all of these as well. Tennis, softball, basketball, hockey, just an extraordinary athlete. And in fact, she would be named an award winner later on. It comes up in our presentation. But who I'm going to start with today is Charlie Conacher. Charlie Conacher was the right winger for the Toronto Maple Leafs. He led or tied the NHL in goal scoring 5 times between 1930 and 1936. So he became legend. He was a big part of Foster. He was broadcast at those times as well, as popular an athlete as there was, certainly on the hockey side of things. When the Gardens was built in 1931, it was the Big Bomber, along with his Kid Line teammates, who really helped fill that arena every single night for the fans of Toronto as well. And of course 1931-32, not of course, but 1931-32, the Leafs won the Stanley Cup that year, their first year in Maple Leaf Gardens. So he was a really important part of the lay of the land at that particular time. His brother was a gentleman named Lionel Conacher, and when we talk about multi-sport athletes, it's quite extraordinary that Lionel could excel in all of the sports that he did. He was 9 years older than his brother Charlie. He was the darling of the sports world at that time for sure, whereas Charlie was the darling of the hockey world specifically. Lionel was the darling for many other things as well. I'm going to read something that that authors Frank Cosentino and Don Morrow wrote. Whether it was flying tackles in wrestling, rink length, speed-gathering dashes in hockey, battering ram and explosive running in football, or cradling the lacrosse ball against his body while steaming towards the opponent's goal area, all these reinforced the image of Conacher's sheer physical dominance. He excelled in all of those sports that I just mentioned and more as well. Just to put it in perspective, this kind of will give you an idea. The Canadian Football Hall of Fame, 1963 inductee. Canadian Lacrosse Hall of Fame in 1965, he was inducted in that prestigious institution. Hockey Hall of Fame in 1994. Ontario Sports Hall of Fame, 1996. Canada Sports Hall of Fame, 1995. Canada's male athlete of the first half century in 1950. So it just puts into perspective the extraordinary talents of this amazing athlete. So Lionel Conacher was playing with the Toronto Argonauts, and they faced the Edmonton Eskimos in the first West-East Grey Cup Championship. The time was December 3rd, 1921. They played at Varsity Stadium. And those, again, in the Toronto area will certainly know Varsity Stadium on Bloor Street, just past Avenue Road. The Argonauts won 23-0. Lionel rushed for 211 yards and 15 points of those 23, led the team to the Grey Cup Championship. Phenomenal. As an amateur as well, by the way. 1922, he becomes the captain of the Argonauts, and they went undefeated through the season for the second consecutive season. So despite winning championships in wrestling and lacrosse and the Memorial Cup with the Toronto Canoe Club Paddlers, he was still considered an amateur at that particular time. But that all changed shortly thereafter. He was enticed to move to Pittsburgh to join a team called the Pittsburgh Yellow Jackets. They were in the United States Amateur Hockey Association at that time. And he went down there with the promise, again, being amateur, the promise of getting his schooling at that time. He hadn't had a whole lot to that point, but his schooling, and also he would be given a job with an insurance company at that time. So that would help finance things. Still an amateur. He led the team, the Yellow Jackets, to championships in 1924 and 1925. So he went down there, and that's where his prowess really bloomed. He was certainly well known in Toronto, certainly well known in Canada, but now all of a sudden he was the darling in the United States as well. And he decided that he was going to form the first professional football team in Canada. And it was called the Cross and Blackwell Chefs. And they were sponsored by Cross and Blackwell. Many of you, as you're driving along the Queensway along Bathurst, you'll have seen that building before. Cross and Blackwell was an amazing company making relishes and meat sauces and jellies and things of that sort. If you were driving along Lakeshore, as I mentioned, at Bathurst, you would have found that building. It existed there for a long time, but then later on it became the home of CFMT television. Some of you may have seen that place and go, oh, that's that place that Shea was talking about, whatever. It was just down the road from Maple Leaf Stadium. Now, sadly, and I can't say it's a surprise, but it's going to be a condo development. So there we go, the history behind it there. So Lionel Conacher wants to become the leader of the first professional football team in Canada. He's 33 years old. His best days behind him, at least as far as football goes, were well behind him. And he recruited a really interesting array of players to join the team, several of whom were athletes from other sports that he figured you can adapt and play football as well. So, for example, Maze McLean. Maze McLean was a football player in the United States. He had played as well, but he later went on to a wrestling career. Where's Greg Oliver? There we go. Familiar with Maze McLean? Well, here, let me school you on that. No. He joined the National Football League as Chief McLean, and he wrestled as the Masked Marauder. So there we are. He also had wrestlers like Jumpin' Joe Savaldi and Alex Kasaboski, who was known as the Pitiless Pole. And again, they weren't football players per se, but they were recruited to play football on this Cross and Blackwell Chefs team that Lionel was putting together. Hap Watson was also one. He was the pitcher for the Oslers that I mentioned a little bit earlier. Very good athlete, and he was also the very first public address announcer for the Toronto Maple Leafs. but I'll quote him here, or I'll quote a message here. His comedy is exceeded only by his ability as a baseball player. The official fun maker must weigh 225 pounds, and every pound is a giggle. Boy. Some of the other players who were on the team, Duke McCurry, Eddie Convey. Eddie Convey had played with Charlie back in junior hockey as well. And the recruited quarterback for the team, Charlie Conacher. Never played organized football before, but he played some football, and all of a sudden he becomes the quarterback for the Cross and Blackwell Chefs. So Charlie Conacher had been a second-team All-Star that year. I'm talking about 1932-33. Charlie and his Kidline teammates finished first, second, and third in scoring that year as well. Conn Smythe, as you can imagine, had objected to his request to play professional lacrosse. For whatever reason, and I can't figure it out and have found nothing about it, he didn't balk at Charlie playing professional football. But anyway, so we go. The Toronto Daily Star and the Globe as well questioned why he would be allowed to play those sports when he was such a star at the time, but he was, and that's the way it went. The Cross and Blackwell Chefs were coached by a gentleman named Mike Rodden. And Mike Rodden had very, very briefly coached the Toronto St. Patrick's. He had played for the Toronto Argonauts in 1919 and 1920. He coached in the International Rugby Football Union for 7 seasons and won a Grey Cup with Hamilton, with the Hamilton Tigers. Not yet the Tiger Cats. That was a reunion later on. That was in 1928 and 1929. Coached, as I mentioned, the Toronto St. Patrick's in January 1927. Mike Rodden, which played a great part in the publicity around the Cross and Blackwell Chefs, was also a journalist and a writer for the Globe and Mail. So that's where they got most of their ink, as you might imagine, too. They couldn't get a league put together at that time, and they weren't sanctioned by any league at that particular time, so they played exhibition games. They played their home games at Maple Leaf Stadium, and their first game was against the Rochester Arpicos. Follow that name for a moment. It was an 18-15 loss for Toronto, but the Rochester Packing Company was the Arpicos. Arpicos, there we go. Next game was against the Rochester Arpicos again, in Rochester. It was a 12-6 loss, so they're down 2 games to none. They played the Buffalo Bison, and that was an 18-0 win. So that was the season. 3 games for the Cross and Blackwell Chefs, 1 win and 2 losses at that particular time. The Globe was, I mentioned, very, very good to the players. Lionel Conacher stole the show and sent 13,000 fans into ecstasies of delight. The Star said, "Never before has there been such an exhibition of punting as this great Canadian star exhibited last night." That was against the Buffalo Bison. So he hadn't lost it. He was still there. As far as Charlie goes, he drew rounds of applause for his sensational performance. It was ever a threat, and his passing was superb. So he was loved once again there, and he seemed to do all right as a quarterback too. So just days before the Cross and Blackwell Chefs season, Lionel had been traded from the Montreal Maroons to the Chicago Blackhawks. Partly it was because, as his brother Charlie would say, he was prone to drink Canada Dry, and I don't mean the ginger ale. He had some major problems with the New York Americans, and not the Montreal Maroons, pardon me, the New York Americans, and that was the best thing for him, to get out of that environment and move forward that way. Football hadn't tarnished him. He led Chicago to the Stanley Cup Championship that year. He was the runner-up to Aurel Joliet for the first All-Star team as well, and for the Hart Trophy, and he also made the first All-Star team. Charlie, no worse the wear for playing football either. He joined his brother on the first All-Star team as well. He also still led the NHL in goals and points. So playing professional football had no detriment to the skills of the 2 Conacher brothers. By the time the 1934 schedule came along, they had a new sponsor. It was Wrigley's Aero Mints. And Aero Mints were what we would know as lifesavers at the time. And Wrigley's was trying to compete with lifesavers. And that's what that was all about. Lionel and Charlie returned, of course, to the team. Much of the same team was there as well, but they added a couple of guys from the NHL. Glenn Bryson, Harold Starr from the Maroons, Yip Foster from the Red Wings, as well as Jack Portland from Montreal Canadiens. So, again, athletes, not football, but athletes who could ply their trade in that way. Charlie felt that the best way to get into condition for the long hockey season was to play football. So, of course, he convinced Conn Smythe that way. Whether that was true or not, I don't know. The season, once again, was exhibition games, 3 games that were played. They played the Rochester Oxfords this time, not the Arpicos. They won 17-6 this time at Maple Leaf Stadium. Played the Buffalo Bison in the next game at Maple Leaf Stadium. They win 19-5. They played the Buffalo Tonawandas, and they won 10-7. So they ran the season, won 3 games, and didn't lose any at that particular time. Well, Lionel was disheartened because a professional Canadian Football League had failed to material by this time. He had hoped that his efforts would lead into exactly that, but in fact it didn't, despite his efforts. He lost his enthusiasm for football. He found it a grind, and it had really taken its toll on him physically as well. And yet he was back with the Maroons that year, and he won his 2nd straight Stanley Cup championship. And they won the Stanley Cup by beating his brother's Toronto Maple Leafs team that year. Charlie, same thing. He led the NHL in both goals and points. Once again, after that season, he was a first-team All-Star. So perhaps because of the immense popularity of the Chefs and the Aeromints, the 2 exhibition teams that I talked about, Canadian football evolved from an amateur game to a professional sport. Whether it had anything to do with those, tough to say. We'll take credit for it, or the Conachers will for sure, but tough to say. But as far as Lionel and Charlie were concerned, football was over. During the summer of 1935, they didn't get another team together. They had been expected to put a team out, but they chose not to for a 3rd season of football. Instead, they purchased a gas station. Some of you who know the Toronto area fairly well or have been here before, if you're going down Yonge Street at Davenport, there's the Masonic Temple looming on the, whatever it would be, the northwest corner. They were on the northeast corner. It was there had been a parkette there when I was a younger man for the longest time, but the gas station had been long gone. But they had that gas station there for a couple of years anyway. On the July day they opened, the Globe reported, hundreds of men and boys attended, and before the evening closed, the Conachers had their arms stiffened and writer's cramped from slinging down their autographs. And so it went. Time went on. Charlie retired after the 1940-41 season. He went on to coach the Oshawa Generals in the Ontario Hockey Association. They won the Memorial Cup in 1944. Later coached the Chicago Blackhawks, didn't have the same kind of success he had there. They never saw playoff action while Charlie was coaching the team, and he was fired after the 1949-50 season and went from there. One of the good things about it was Charlie was able to coach his youngest brother, not youngest brother, but his brother Roy, a younger brother at that point, who was a member of the Chicago Blackhawks. Charlie Conacher died on December 30th, 1967 of throat cancer. Lionel, in the meantime, retired following the 1936-37 season. He went into politics from there. He was elected as a Liberal member of provincial parliament for the Toronto riding of Brackendale in 1937. He served as chairman of the Ontario Athletic Commission at the same time. In 1949, he was elected as member of parliament for the Trinity riding. Some of those don't exist anymore, but that's the way it was back then. On December 31st, 1950, this is what I alluded to earlier, the Canadian press announced the winners of the male and female best athlete of the first half century. Bobby Rosenfeld, who I referred to earlier, won as the greatest female athlete of between 1900 and 1950. There was no doubt on the greatest male athlete at that time of the first half century was Lionel Conacher. Picture of the entire Conacher family here. You see a large family, they had 10 children. Pretty amazing that they had 3 Hall of Famers, Charlie, Lionel, and Roy. Bert was the twin brother of Roy, and many people felt that he could have gone to the National Hockey League as well, but he lost an eye playing street hockey. Charlie lifted his stick and caught him in the eye, and he was blind in one eye. So it ended his chances of playing professional hockey, but he was quite a good hockey player as well. Great athletes all the way around. Dermot, the oldest son, was a very good football player. Not good enough to play on Lionel's teams, though, but anyway, there we go. The twin girls, as you can see there, Nora and Kay, to our lower right, were outstanding baseball players during the 1930s as well. And Dottie, the mother, second from the left on the bottom row, she's the mother of Murray Henderson, who played in the National Hockey League with the Boston Bruins. So quite a family all in all. And there we are, the gridiron exploits of the big train and the big bomber. There we go.